Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Over the weekend, President Joe Biden announced that he will not be seeking re-election in 2024, and instead he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. Here to explain this moment in time and a piece that she wrote about why Biden should actually resign the presidency is presidential historian Alexis Coe. Alexis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so on Friday, you wrote, and the headline is, Biden should resign the presidency to save his legacy. Take us through this argument. Why did you write this? Why do you think this?
As a presidential historian, I really love finding some fact that we take to be true and then dismantling it. I can find the origin, I can find the progenitor of the untruth, and I can bury this narrative in a mountain of citations, and it's a lot of fun. I enjoy it, and it makes a little bit of a difference. But I am Sisyphus. The second I go to sleep, the boulder rolls down the hill, and I push it right back up, because the reality is that it has ossified over hundreds of years. I am always at least a century too late. But I usually see that in the past. This is a slow process. It happens when I'm alone in a room or in an archive. To watch it in real time has been staggering. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. And so it got to the point where the weeks went on and on. At first, I was saying, oh, it's just a bad debate. A lot of presidents have bad debates. Reagan had a terrible first debate, made a good joke. Everything was fine after. But then it was clear that we just hadn't seen Joe Biden in a long time in this kind of way, and that he had been managed. And I began to think about his legacy and what it was doing to it.
What is the precedent, if any, for Biden resigning the presidency? Are there other examples that we should know about?
There's almost none in this particular case. Certainly, we heard a lot about the 25th Amendment when Trump was president. A president can be removed for different reasons. The president can resign. Nixon resigned. We're used to resignations happening on the heels of some sort of scandal, and that's not necessarily what this is. It was, I still think it might be the right move, but I've been happy to see the reaction to Biden. And I was dismayed also to see the double standard. So many people were bemoaning that, for example, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of the publications, after the debate, it was like it was a debate with one person. And all they did was focus on Biden. Biden must step down. Biden must step aside. And there was no focus on Trump whatsoever. And now that has shifted a little bit. And we see this slight course correction, but there's still a lot of problems with what it took to get him there. My theory is, and it's just a working theory, it's based actually not on a historian, but on a scientist. Daniel Kahneman, the late Nobel Prize winner, said in Thinking Fast and Slow that endings matter. So if you have a terrible 2 days, but they're the last 2 days of your vacation, and the previous, 12 were amazing, you're still going to remember it as not a great vacation. And so I think if everything goes the way of the Biden administration, which will now be the continuity, will be the Harris administration, he will go down as, being an ally to the only two presidents of color for the first 250 years of America's history. But if that doesn't happen, that chapter in his book will now be half the book, that he waited too long, that he was stubborn. There will be all these facts that come out. So as far as his legacy, it looks really good right now, but we're still in the throes of things. As we know, it's been a really wild ride.
I see. So effectively what you're arguing at this moment, and you published this on Friday before he officially stepped out of the race, those signals were kind of indicating that he might be thinking of leaning that way. You're basically saying he's getting a lot of accolades right now, but if Vice President Harris receives the nomination and goes on to compete in the general and then loses to former President Trump, that muddies President Biden's legacy, and to secure his legacy, he should just step down now and give us a President Harris?
I think that still might be, while an extreme move, it still might be necessary, because what hasn't happened that's essential is the party has not fallen behind Kamala Harris. What we see is 500 and counting delegates within hours. But Biden, even the day before, people were still saying, and he was still saying, even though he was home with COVID, that he was not going to give it, that he was going to fight till the end. And so the issue we have now is that there's a very good chance that she will be primaried. Barack Obama has not endorsed her. He gave this sort of vague endorsement. He praised Biden, but it was vague. And maybe, you know, if we're looking at this in the sunniest of terms, he perhaps wanted Kamala Harris to get the endorsement from Biden, let that settle, let everything else come in, and then he does it. But I just can't see that. And what we do know is from the 60s and the 70s, Gerald Ford with Reagan, and Jimmy Carter with Ted Kennedy, that if an incumbent, which essentially she is, she's been the second for the last 4 years, if an incumbent is primaried, they might suffer through the convention and do okay, but they will not come out stronger, and in fact a lot weaker. Being internally attacked hurts more, it's a little bit more biting, and it's a little bit more truthful than we usually see attacks from the outside. So it will be possibly devastating. It will definitely hurt her. But we do have at the same time this question, and Trump just announced his VP at the first day of the convention. We don't know who her VP is. We think we know, but we don't know. So there's still so many questions, and it's an evolving situation. And frankly, while a little bit stressful and certainly taking all our attention, it seems like it's the excitement that everyone needed. We had this sort of geriatric race going, and I don't usually say this, but Nikki Haley was right. She's not great on American history, but she was right. She said that, whoever doesn't have the 80-year-old candidate will suddenly get all the attention and do quite well. So far, got to hand it to Haley.
It's interesting because we saw from the fundraising platform Act Blue that as of 9 p.m. Sunday night, close to $50 million had been raised from grassroots campaign support, regular people donating small dollar amounts that seemed to indicate a significant amount of enthusiasm. It was at that point the largest one-day total for the 2024 election. But in your view, you talked about Vice President Harris doesn't have all the delegates yet. So you're kind of looking at the landscape as it exists right now and seeing a more fractured picture than what some of these fundraising totals would indicate?
Yes. I mean, fits and starts, right? Very impressive for the first day or two, but she's got a very late start. And she's catching up to Trump, and he's done quite well. So we have to wait and see what happens. It's really touch and go at this point. But I think that the response has been quite good. Trump has said that he will not debate Harris. I think that debate, while often I say debates don't really matter, and they don't, historically speaking, it's like early polling. The polls don't even start to matter for another, month or so. But we're in a different landscape right now. And it seems like people will tune in because they don't know Harris that well. The reality of the vice presidency, John Adams called it the most irreverent irrelevant office that his people had ever, deigned to conceive of. And she has been present, but certainly not the way Joe Biden was present when he was the vice president and he was Barack Obama's buddy. So we haven't seen her be quite as active. I have to say, though, I'm at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I have always been shocked by the incongruous narratives I hear in the rest of the country when I travel around as a senior fellow during discussions tours. I hear nothing really about Kamala Harris. And then when I'm in DC, there are all these stories about how she just went abroad and she ran this conference and that meeting and this, and she was so great. So we have to see some of that. And it's got to be either in the news or the way American politics works now, a good late night show with Trump.
Or to the point of your op-ed, as president if Biden were to resign. Now, I have to ask you, we've seen some calls from the right for the invocation of the 25th Amendment. Do you think Vice President Harris should invoke the 25th Amendment right now? And for those who aren't familiar with it, can you explain what it is?
The 25th Amendment is basically a safety net for America. If the president in some way cannot function, that either Congress or the president can resign, there are measures in which Biden can be replaced by Harris. It gets tricky. Now, I will say that at the same time that some of the Republicans are calling for that, other Republicans are saying this is illegal. He must stay in the race. He cannot step down. The Speaker of the House is. And so we see an unusually fractured party for Republicans. Whatever it is, they usually fall in line. Questioning and challenging, that's more of a Democratic attribute. So that's been really interesting. However, I think it's notable, and people aren't really talking about it as much. And I'm going to sound a bit like a conspiracy theorist, and I don't mean to, but I think it's a little bit strange that Biden hasn't shown his face yet, and that he didn't make this announcement in some well-orchestrated press conference. He has COVID, okay, but it must be really bad. And so unless we hear something about that, or these theories about the doctor visiting the White House and allegedly him having Parkinson's, if those things do turn out to be true, then I think a natural and very logical discussion that America should be having, and perhaps it's going on right now in DC, is the 25th Amendment. But for right now, it's a wait and see. I still think it would be a wise idea for his legacy because it is so dramatic, but I am fine with this happening in steps, just as long as there is some progress. We can't have a double standard. You can't say one party must hold country over party and, make sure that the de facto leader of the party is fit for office, and then at the same time say, well, but he's so unfit that this guy who's a little bit unfit is still okay. This is not the way that a democracy can function. And so I'm glad to see people are stepping away from the double standard.
When you think about the message that Biden is sending, he wants to focus on the remainder of his presidency. He's putting forth someone else to run for president. Again, she doesn't officially have the nomination yet, but that seems to be messaging that would support. There's a logical conclusion to resigning the presidency, perhaps. But I guess what I'm wondering is it an abdication of duty of Vice President Harris to not call for the 25th Amendment, if you're looking at it with that if-then scheme of thinking?
If we find out that he is greatly incapacitated past what we saw at the debate and what we've seen in other instances, then she will have some serious questions and will lose the trust of the American people. That's a given. And it will be a scandal, and it will increase the cynicism of the office, which has been something that I feel on a daily basis and combat all the time. I receive questions from audiences and emails. People think that the president, so the leader of the free world, is completely without a moral compass. And what Kamala Harris needs to do is bring back humanity. If she is disingenuous to such a great degree, then that is questionable. However, because of Trump, she can't really be held accountable in any way. He now, he successfully garnered presidential immunity from the Supreme Court. So it's tricky times. I spent so many years saying there's no precedent for this. And indeed, there's no precedent for this.
There's no precedent for this. Even for an incapacitated president, if you go all the way back to George Washington, there's never been a moment.
Oh, there has. It's been a cover-up every single time. Calvin Coolidge, for example, he's known as Silent Cal or Slow Cal. People talk about how he completely checked out. Well, if you go back to the time period and you look at his diaries and the things that are being written about him, he wouldn't know that, they wouldn't know that at the time. But now we see he was clinically depressed. His weight fluctuated wildly. He had mood swings. He slept at odd hours, sometimes all the time, sometimes none of the time. And the reason is quite obvious. It wasn't a chemical imbalance, although, of course, that might have been an issue as well. I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm not a diagnostician, but we know a really obvious thing happened to him when he was in the White House. His teenage son died. He was playing tennis on the White House grounds. He got a blister, it turned into sepsis, and he died. And of course, Calvin Coolidge felt incredibly guilty about that happening. I think his son probably would have played tennis anywhere, and perhaps this might have happened, but it did happen there, and it happened because he was president. He was also, though, I will say, not the nicest man. So there's a lot going on there, but he checked out. We know Edith Wilson, of course, with Woodrow Wilson. There have been some very bizarre articles about how Joe Biden is basically the new Edith Wilson. We would know that. That would be far more obvious. You can't get away with that in this day and age. And she's also traveling on her own. It's not like she's on, by his side all the time. Biden, his strengths can, in some ways, manage a not incapacitated 25th Amendment compelling sort of situation, but something that he will get credit for later, that he doesn't get a lot of credit for right now because this is not the most interesting thing to talk about. It's like civil service reform with Chester A. Arthur. Nobody really gets that excited about it, but Biden is a great manager. He's had almost no loss of people around him, and they're people who have come up with him. He trusts them. They were very young during the Obama administration. I was at the Democracy Forum, and both Michelle and Barack talked a lot about that, how they were seeing people who were just kids and they were straight out of college. Now they have children. They have stuck around in jobs like Secretary of State, things that people usually leave after a couple of years, or maybe as they see the president is either going to run for re-election or not. Maybe it's the end of a second term. Biden has had an incredible staying power, whereas, sometimes Trump would have someone for a week and then they'd be gone in a pretty high profile situation. So the stability of the Biden administration, despite the fact that we might have a leader who is not the leader he was 4 years ago, it does not seem to be at the point where we should really be screaming bloody murder.
What has been the reaction to your piece since it came out on Friday? Have you been hearing from Democrats or Republicans who agree with you?
Yes, I had an overwhelming amount of responses. I have written a lot of op-eds in my time, many for the New York Times and places I think that get, as much or more traffic than Rolling Stone. But I don't think I've ever had such a strong reaction to pieces. It was probably the closest I will ever get to a personal essay because I talked about my research and what it's like to try and combat some of these legacy issues and these false narratives. I got a lot of people saying, yes, this is important, because it's not that I'm saying this guy is going to ruin his reputation. He will go down if this goes smoothly as the most progressive president of the 21st century. He rivals FDR. He has accomplished so much. And certainly in pretty bad circumstances, we were at home, not able to leave when he took office. And then we were. That's pretty significant. Our lives drastically changed. And if we were to parentify these presidents, because they are both older men and we live in a patriarchal society, we can say that it's much better to have Biden as the de facto head of your household than Trump. It was just it was a drastic change in his legacy that I saw. All of a sudden, none of that mattered. Not even the negative parts of his legacy. Gaza, for example, nobody was talking about that anymore. And so what I think happened was there was this moment where people said, this is fair. It's not just about age. It's about the bigger picture and how he has affected our lives. Because I think it was really personal for people in a way that they weren't really able to express when it was just about someone who seemed slow or, arthritic or possibly having Parkinson's. And then on the flip side, there was still a small number of people, and gratefully small, who were upset that I would even suggest that people should not support Biden blindly, and didn't really get the hypocrisy. If you're saying that the Republicans need to hold Trump accountable, Democrats need to hold Biden accountable. So there was, of course, that. But I will say that I was really excited. And then there's a lot of theories of people who work in DC that Biden saw it, which I don't actually believe. I think he's a pretty busy man. But I do think that the most compelling argument for him, because he is a lifelong civil servant, this is not something he didn't just wake up like RFK Jr. at the age of 70 and decide, oh, I think I'll be president now. He's been working at this for a long time. But the duality of Joe Biden, this ambitious man, and everyone's ambitious. It's not a bad thing. How do you get to be president? And a lot of people, me included, do not want to be president. And that was really sort of overwhelming, this incredible history of service. And so that is something that I think is meaningful. And I think it is compelling to him either way. Whoever made the argument, legacy is on his mind. The reaction in the aftermath, I will say, as I was doing press yesterday and today in wake of the announcement, I was surprised to constantly get questions, because usually these hits are 2-3 minutes long, 4 minutes if you're on live TV. I was really surprised to get so many questions about Hunter Biden. In the grand scheme of things, he is not a huge part of Biden's legacy. And the questions were kind of wild and suggest that a double standard still exists.
When you talk about double standards, again, we have to emphasize Vice President Harris is not yet officially the nominee, but a lot of the narrative around her is she is 59. She is almost 20 years younger than the Republican candidate. So do you expect age to continue to be a factor in this race? And as a presidential historian, do you think there's maybe some groundwork for age limits in the presidency based on what we've seen in this election cycle?
Absolutely. We have a lower limit of 35 because at the Constitutional Convention, a man named George Mason introduced it. And what I love about this anecdote is then George Mason decided he got that through. He argued that point. People disagreed with him. He said, I won't sign it unless you have that in. The framers put it in, and then it got to signing time. What did George Mason do? He didn't sign it. He decided not to because he didn't agree with other things, particularly slavery. So then this still exists because at 35, George Mason thought he wasn't mature enough. So this is also just based on a single person. And George Washington, when I think about him around 26, I don't think so. 35, 36, maybe. Really depends on the individual. JFK was one of our youngest presidents. He was not president at 35, but he started to think about it then. He also had 10 years in Congress, though. There are a lot of things that we should codify. And the founders and the framers also believed that people would naturally serve in Congress at some point during those 35 years, at least for one term, so that they would understand, how a bill becomes a law. And we haven't seen that. The other thing I will say is that George Washington left office after 2 terms. That was his own personal choice. Nobody told him he had to. And in fact, even though most of the founders were frenemies of his at that point, they were still really interested in him staying in office because he created stability. And he said, no, I don't want this to look like I'm a king. If I die in office, that sets a precedent. People will continue to be in office until they're quite old. And the only reason I entered office as an older man is because I was fighting the revolution. It's just timing. It wasn't great. But we see a lot of notes in his diaries and in letters to people. He talks about how things are hurting. He's not the man he once was, and he wants to exit gracefully. He didn't want to cling on to power.
Didn't want to cling on to power. So there's a degree to which we heard that from President Biden on Sunday. Alexis, I want to ask, as the final question to this interview, what is your prediction over what we'll see over the next 3 months? Do you think he'll take the advice of your op-ed and resign the presidency, and we'll see a President Harris before November?
That would certainly be a fantasy. It would be a bit of fan fiction. Not quite the fan fiction that came out on Sunday. I have to say the news came within hours. I don't think it was my op-ed, but it might have been Sorkin's op-ed, because he published one in the Times that was really the only apt word choice is bonkers. He thought that Mitt Romney, who I think 2 to 5% of Americans still believe his first name is Mittens, that he should be president, that the Democrats should elect Mitt Romney. And so that was really quite an extreme reaction. I think that if COVID takes a real toll on him, if we don't see him by the end of the week, that people should be pushing for questions. They should be pushing for answers, and they should be asking very specific questions. And it's possible. Things seem to be moving quickly. We saw him a lot last year. This will come out in the years to come, and we'll understand the exact timeline of when he started to sort of be at this diminished state. Right now, he's not the Joe Biden that he was, but he's not unfit for office. So we'll see about that. Certainly not running, not going to rallies, not keeping this kind of schedule that he was not keeping, but he was definitely had an amplified schedule. That should be a little bit easier on him, but we don't know. We have not actually seen him for that long outside of the debate. And then we'll see how Harris responds to this doing double duty, because it is not an easy thing to be vice president, and who she selects as her VP while she's campaigning. Those are a lot of hats.
There is so much that has to happen over the next 100 days and change. And Alexis Coe, we thank you for joining us to explain at least what we've seen over the last 24 to 36 hours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.